That to me is what this really is about. And I think a lot of the debates kind of get murky and lost in legal weeds sometimes about it.
Hmm.
But I think they primarily, because their policies are unpopular, they want to make it impossible for anybody to do anything about right wing propaganda.
Welcome to Law and Chaos. Who's the worst Trump administration nominee south of Kash Patel? It's a crowded field, but there's a strong case to be made for Brendan Carr, Trump's pick to head the Federal Communications Commission. We'll talk to tech journalist Carl Bode about why. We've got a lot to cover, so let's get after it. Happy Friday, Chaos Monkeys. I'm Liz Dye, and with me, as always, is Andrew Torres. Andrew, how are you?
Hey, Liz, I am like a lot of our listeners, just trying to get through this one day at a time.
Yeah, so one of the ways we are trying to get through the day is by paying attention to all the evil shit that the Supreme Court is doing. And yesterday, they held a hearing in U.S. v. Skrmetti, the case challenging Tennessee's ban on gender-confirming care for minors. It was brutal, but we're going to talk about that a little bit more today. We had a long post in the newsletter, and we're going to talk about that. We're going to talk about equal protection. We're going to talk about beer. And we have an interview with Carl Bode. He's a tech journalist at Techdirt. He's great. He'll talk to us, as we said in the intro, about the FCC and Trump's nominee, Brendan Carr. And what do you got for us in the Patreon, Andrew?
Yeah, another way in which we manage to get through on a day-by-day basis is by, crying when we must, but laughing when we can. And we have the funniest subscriber bonus for you about Rudy Giuliani. America's mayor is facing two separate contempt orders in two different courts, right? So this story has everything. It has procedural whackassery. It has terrible lawyering. It's basically everything you love about the show, and I think you're going to enjoy it.
Yes. Okay. But before that, let's circle back to Skrmetti,
Mm-hmm.
because as you said, Andrew, we listened to the oral arguments. We wrote a long post about our reaction. And in the written post, we kind of went into it in a level of detail that does not lend itself to the podcast format. So go read it. We've linked it in the show notes. But I think we really do want to kind of talk about the sleight of hand that we heard unfold during oral argument yesterday.
Yeah, this was, you noticed this, we both agreed, right? Like, in a very real sense, the Supreme Court's right wing has lied to all of the litigants in this case, U.S. v. Skrmetti, right? Because the way that this case has been briefed and argued from the very beginning, like all the way back to the trial court level, was over what standard of scrutiny should apply in this equal protection challenge. But on Wednesday, at oral argument, all of a sudden a majority of the Supreme Court didn't care about that question at all, right? I mean, they wanted to get into the weeds on the facts, the UK's Cass report, Sweden, the off-label use of puberty blockers, infertility rates associated with hormone therapy, right? All sorts of stuff that no appellate court, let alone the Supreme Court, should care about in the slightest, right? Like, that's why you have a trial court. That's why they had a record, but, the Supreme Court didn't seem to notice or care here. And look, that's not because they're idiots, right? These are very, very smart people. And the reason why the court's howler monkey wing is very invested in obscuring what this case is really about is because the underlying question here is really simple. It's this: is a law that bans all trans kids from receiving any gender-affirming care, is that law more like, a traffic law or a tax cut? Or is it more like laws prohibiting women from working certain jobs or from people marrying outside their race?
Right. And the answer to that one is obvious, which is why the howler monkeys wanted to talk about like random studies from the UK and, fertility rates instead of the obvious legal issue at hand.
Yeah, because look, even if you're for SB1, and let's be clear, that would be wrong, right? But those people would have to admit that SB1 is not an ordinary law, right? And yet the Supreme Court is about to hold that it is.
Yeah, I think it's pretty clear from oral argument what's about to happen here. I mean, it's horrendous, but, the math is the math, and it's a 6-3 court. It's going to be bad.
Yeah, and it's going to be a 6-3 decision. So let's talk about why that's such a travesty. And again, from this show, not just because the outcome, but because of what it means about how the Supreme Court is about to rewrite what equal protection of the laws means, right? So for most of our nation's history, equal protection of the law meant nothing, right? And I mean that from 1789 to the 20th century, like absolutely nothing, right? We had slavery, and then we abolished slavery, but had institutionalized segregation, right? From housing to schools to marriage and family. So what we now call strict scrutiny for purposes of equal protection analysis traces back to this language from the Supreme Court in 1944. It said, all legal restrictions which curtail the civil rights of a single racial group are immediately suspect. That is not to say that all such restrictions are unconstitutional. It is to say that courts must subject them to the most rigid scrutiny. Pressing public necessity may sometimes justify the existence of such restrictions, but racial antagonism never can.
Yeah, I see what you're doing there. That language comes from Korematsu versus United States. That's the decision upholding the internment of Japanese American citizens in concentration camps during World War II. And yes, the Supreme Court imposed a strict scrutiny requirement, but it upheld the law or the order. It said there was evidence of disloyalty on the part of some. The military authorities considered that the need for action was great and time was short. We cannot, by availing ourselves of the calm perspective of hindsight, now say that at the time those actions were unjustified. The case was finally overturned, but not until 2018.
Right. And my point here is that from the beginning, equal protection was brought before the courts as a binary question, right? So if a law, or in that case, a presidential executive order, if it discriminated on the basis of race or national origin, it would fall into this very tiny strict scrutiny bucket, right? And for the most part, and Korematsu, as you point out, is an ugly exception, if a law triggered strict scrutiny, that meant it would be struck down, right? That the test to survive strict scrutiny, the government bears the burden of proof, and it must prove that the law is narrowly tailored to achieve a compelling state interest. So unless the government's interest is very, very high, and the law is pretty much the only way to achieve it, that law doesn't survive strict scrutiny.
Right. And for everything that didn't fall into that strict scrutiny bucket, the law would be subject to rational basis scrutiny. The law was presumed valid, and the person challenging the law, that is not the government, would bear the burden of proving that the government either had no legitimate interest in the law whatsoever, or that there was no rational connection between the law itself and the goals the government was trying to achieve.
Yeah, and that level of scrutiny survives to this day. And we got some questions on our Substack and at patreon.com on this, like saying, really, it's enough for the government to just assert any purpose whatsoever, and they don't have to prove it or offer any evidence that that's a real thing. And I get it. But I want to say that for ordinary laws, the answer to that question is and should be yes, right? Like, so, for example, if your local county council decides to take the two-way road in front of your house and make it into a one-way road, right? They've now restricted your liberty, right? Like your neighbors who live one street over, they can turn left or right out of their driveway, but you now can only turn right. And look, like that kind of case probably shouldn't wind up in a constitutional challenge in federal court.
Unless it involves Hunter Biden, because if that guy turns out of his driveway the wrong direction, Kash Patel and Pam Bondi are going to impanel a grand jury immediately.
Facts. Okay. But look, in general, we want the government to be able to say, look, we don't want our citizens to get into traffic accidents, and we think, turning this street into a one-way street will probably help stop that. And, if we're wrong and we suck at it, like, just vote us out of office. You don't have to go to court, right? The problem is that either-or framework seemed to miss out on a lot of laws, right? That weren't naked racial classifications, but they weren't traffic laws either. And it took beer for the Supreme Court to figure that out.
Is this about Justice Kavanaugh? Because screw that guy.
You're the one who made me delete Justice Kegstand from our...
I know. He wanted to put Justice Kegstand in our written post, and I was like, no, this is a serious issue. We're talking about, children's civil rights here. We're not going to call him Justice Kegstand. But on the show, for the purposes of the show, knock yourself out.
Fair. And in the spirit of that, Liz, let's you and I time travel back to 1976, right? Disco and Fresca for everybody.
I wouldn't remember that, but you would.
Oh, yeah, right. Okay. But first, let's take a quick ad break, unless you're a subscriber over at patreon.com/lawncastpod or at lawncastpod.com on Substack, at which point no ads for you ever, not even if you are a disco legend. And we're back. Okay, so since its inception, the age of majority in first the territory and then later the state of Oklahoma was 18 for women and 21 for men. Okay, so in other words, for civil matters, the state considered a 20-year-old woman to be an adult, but a 20-year-old man to be a child. And in criminal cases, it was the exact opposite. Men were declared legal adults at age 16, women at age 18.
I've never been to Spain, but I've been to Yeah, we're all going to be having this song in our head forever. Thanks a lot, dude.
Yeah, okay. But with some prodding by the courts, in the surprisingly latter half of the 20th century, the Oklahoma state legislature finally changed the age of majority to just a flat 18 years of age. That was 1972. But even then, the state legislature kept this weird vestige of that two-tiered system. It was illegal to sell or serve beer to women under the age of 18 and men under the age of 21.
Yeah, this I remember. Oklahoma's justification for this discrimination was to introduce data that men were more likely to drive drunk than women. And the state argued that because it had a legitimate interest in promoting traffic safety, its disparate treatment of men and women was rationally related to that goal, and the law did not violate the 14th Amendment's Equal Protection Clause. Mm-hmm. So in other words, Oklahoma argued that the law that distinguished on the basis of sex should be evaluated under rational basis scrutiny and not strict scrutiny. So the plaintiffs in the case challenging this law were a 20-year-old man who wanted to drink some beer and a bar owner who wanted to sell it to him. And they argued that discrimination on the basis of sex was legally tantamount to discrimination on the basis of race, and that therefore strict scrutiny should apply.
And the Supreme Court, as it did a lot in the mid-1970s, split the difference. This was a case called Craig v. Boren from 1976, and the Supreme Court held that laws that classify on the basis of sex deserve heightened or intermediate scrutiny, but not strict scrutiny, right? So unlike racial discrimination, those laws wouldn't be presumptively invalid, but neither would they be given the extreme deference that courts give to, ordinary laws, the one-way street thing. Instead, the burden would still be on the government, right, on the legislature, to show that the classification served an important government objective and that the law at issue was substantially related to achieving that objective. So they loosened both of those requirements. In the case of Oklahoma's beer law, the court said, no, look, that's not good enough, right? The court said the principles embodied in the Equal Protection Clause are not to be rendered inapplicable by statistically measured but loose-fitting generalities concerning the drinking tendencies of aggregate groups by sex. So it got struck down.
And that brings us to today, because if rational basis scrutiny applies to Tennessee's SB 1, then on the basis of some extremely sketchy, not to say bullshit, claims about the supposed harms of gender-affirming care, the Supreme Court is going to uphold the rational basis between the ban and a legitimate state interest in the health of its citizens, or the notion that the children should avoid disdain for their gender, which is a pretty low kind of I'm not really sure what even that means, how it could be a legitimate state interest. But if heightened scrutiny applies, the link is going to collapse because SB 1 is not substantially related to the important government objective of protecting the health of its citizens, and appreciating their sex and, having no disdain is because that's not an important government objective.
Right.
And that's why the Supreme Court was so eager to hide the ball yesterday, or I guess the Wednesday, so 2 days ago as you're listening to this, because these justices are poised to hold as a matter of law that discriminating against trans kids is somehow not discriminating on the basis of sex, and that therefore rational basis scrutiny and not heightened scrutiny should apply. And look, that's nuts. That's ridiculous.
Yeah. And if you want to know why, Again, link is in the show notes. Head to lawandchaospod.com. We really get into the weeds of the specifics of the argument. It's bad as a matter of law, but now that you understand the difference between rational basis and heightened scrutiny, like, I think that's the right context for taking a look at what the Supreme Court is doing.
Yeah, and just as another little dog's leg, we got into it a little bit in the post, but listening to these arguments, and I think this is going to be a theme going forward, you can really tell that many of the conservative justices are what they might call red-pilled, right? So they talk about Sweden and the Cass report, like they talk about a lot of conservative memes, for lack of a better word, right? They're not talking about the Shiba Inu Dogecoin, but when they talk about Sweden, what they're talking about is like a whole litany of things that they mean. And I think as we go forward, we're going to have to watch the ways that right-wing kind of storylines, most of them that are bullshit, are infiltrating our jurisprudence at the highest level, right? That these are supposed to be serious judges who are not consuming, conservative misinformation, and yet they are absolutely steeped in it, particularly Alito.
It is such a good point. And, this is an area where you have been deep in the weeds for a decade. And, from my
perspective, a little too online.
Yeah, no, but look, like, from my perspective, that's been the province of nutball Clarence Thomas dissents for the past decade and a half, right? And it was front and center from Kavanaugh and Roberts, not to mention Alito and Thomas.
It was the whole thing Alito said. I mean, it was basically Alito's whole thing is talking about, the change in laws in Europe, but not in any rational way, just in a way that the right wing is kind of packaging them and saying, well, Europe's retreating. And like, first of all, American judges don't generally give a shit about what Europe's doing. But look, there are certain things that if you observe right-wing media at all, you understand that they kind of say a word. Like during the aftermath of the 2020 election, if anybody would say, well, Antrim, Michigan was a place where there was a problem with the balloting, which was immediately caught, right? That there was a computer glitch, right? And it was human error, and it was immediately fixed. But it was seized upon by Rudy Giuliani and Sidney Powell and any of the rest of these kind of big lie purveyors as evidence that there was systemic problem in the machines, and it's like an algorithmic whatever. And so when you would hear people say blah 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 Antrim County, you're like, oh right, you're crazy. You've spent a lot of time reading kind of right-wing discourse and right-wing misinformation. And we're starting to see that at the Supreme Court, particularly yesterday with Justice Alito, and it's something that we're going to, have to watch for. It's interesting, just as long as we're like on this little rabbit trail. I think that Alito believes it, doesn't know better. I think that Kavanaugh knows that it's bullshit and uses it in his aw shucks folksy way to be like, well, I'm just asking questions, and like, no, dude, you know the difference. You're just lying. Anyway, something to look out for. But okay. Before we get to our interview with Karl Bode, let's frame our issue out a little bit. Remember, this is Donald Trump having announced his intention to nominate Brendan Carr to be chairman of the Federal Communications Commission. That's the FCC. Carr is currently on the board of the FCC, and he has said some wild things that we're going to talk about.
Yeah, you've seen those headlines in the news, and we're not going to ignore them. But like, one of the reasons that we wanted to bring on a veteran tech journalist like Karl Bode was to talk about some of the other aspects of the FCC that are flying under the radar right now, and fully understand how this pick is going to undermine, say, rural efforts to get access to the internet, how it's going to pave the way for graft and hurt consumers, in addition to, publicizing the high profile and stupid fights that Trump wants his nominee to pick with, woke big tech.
Right. Okay, so for background, the FCC, that's the Federal Communications Commission, was established by the Communications Act of 1934, and it was delegated authority to regulate interstate communication. So historically, that meant radio and then TV, and now it includes cell phones and the internet. And in particular, the FCC is directed to, quote, encourage the deployment on a reasonable and timely basis of advanced telecommunications capability to all Americans. In practice, that means delivering broadband internet service to rural areas which are drastically underserved, as well as regulating how those services are delivered across the country.
Yeah, that's one of the things I'm really excited to talk to Karl about. So, look, we all know that Brendan Carr is a MAGA loudmouth loon who's made stupid claims that he knows are false about, revoking NBC's license that doesn't exist, right? Like, that's how he cozied up to Trump and, presumably got this job. But like every executive branch agency, the FCC also exists to, do things. And the Trump administration is going to do its best to make sure that it doesn't do those things.
Exactly. Okay, with that in mind, we're going to take one more ad break, and we will be back with our interview with Karl Bode. With us today is journalist Karl Bode. He's a freelance tech reporter with focus on telecom, media, and consumer rights, whose work often appears at the essential site Techdirt. Thank you so much for being with us today, Karl.
It's my pleasure. Thank you for having me.
So we invited you here today because you have made some words about Brendan Carr. Apparently, he's not your favorite guy. He is Trump's nominee to lead the FCC. But maybe before we get to that, we should talk about what the FCC is and what it does.
So the FCC generally enforces the Communications Act. It has a bunch of varying responsibilities that range from managing the nation's spectrum assets, or doing engineering testing on hardware to make sure stuff doesn't interfere with that spectrum. It also does a little bit of broadcast decency standards enforcement. It's also tasked with, battling media consolidation and trying to make sure the media is generally operating fairly, which I think a lot of that enforcement has fallen off over the years. It's also tasked by Congress with making sure that broadband is deployed in a reasonable and timely basis as per the law.
And would you say that the agency is working well?
No. I think it's a really good shining example of regulatory capture. Generally, I think a lot of the public interest efforts have kind of fallen off over the years.
So unpack what you mean, by regulatory capture.
So the U.S. broadband market is really heavily monopolized. You go into any town and you're going to have one giant cable company and one giant phone company, and like one of them probably hasn't updated their network in the last 15 years. So you don't have much competition, which allows them to jack up prices, offer slow speeds. Their customer service is terrible. And ideally, the FCC is supposed to play at least some role in ensuring that consumers are getting a fair shake or that the broadband's being deployed evenly. But, basic tasks like even mapping broadband access in the U.S., they've failed miserably at over the years.
You want to define mapping?
Just going in and tracking the availability of broadband in granted census level, going into towns and measuring who has access and who doesn't. We had 20 years of broadband policy where they literally did not really know who had access. So we were making all these broad decisions based on flawed data from the start.
Yeah, and I guess if a lot of us live in major cities, it doesn't kind of occur to us how big the gaps are in rural broadband.
Yeah, and the gaps are big in urban broadband as well. I'm here in Seattle, Silicon Valley North, quote unquote, and my only broadband option is Comcast, a capped Comcast connection at $130 a month. Whereas you can go into a small town and they might have a cooperative that's offering gigabit fiber for $70 a month. So it varies, and it's not just an urban rural problem, although
interesting.
Remote areas do have bigger issues on this front. So ideally the FCC is supposed to make sure this is an even process, but they've really struggled to stand up to telecom monopolies with any vigor over the years. And there's been a 20-year protracted legal fight about how much authority they have to do this. Telecom giants obviously want a mostly decorative agency that does, some spectrum management and then stays out of their business. And ultimately, with this Supreme Court, I think that's what they're going to get. I think a lot of the FCC's consumer enforcement stuff is really headed to the trash bin, I'm afraid to say.
Yeah, I want to talk about that. I do want to make sure that we've closed the loop. So the question that we were talking about was regulatory capture. And if I understand properly from what you've just said, essentially what you're saying is that when you have a market that has devolved, whether intentionally or accidentally, into what are essentially a bunch of regional local monopolies, that the regulatory agency can wind up being responsive to working friendly with that monopoly and thus captured, right? And not engaged in oversight and regulation in a way that is kind of consistent with that agency's mission.
Yeah, absolutely right. Yeah, correct. And it's very difficult to get any kind of real reformer onto the FCC. We saw it with the recent attempted appointment of Gigi Sohn, who is a really well-respected consumer advocate. They tried to appoint her, and she was kind of submitted to a long telecom and media industry backed smear campaign that kind of derailed her nomination in the Senate. So it's very hard to get real good faith consumer reformers onto the FCC. So what you wind up getting is a lot of very safe, politically bland choices that are mostly thinking about their next political appointment or their next job at a telecom funded think tank.
Yeah. When I think of regulatory capture, I kind of think of corporate employees cycling into and out of government service as they really represent the agency even when they represent the government. Is that an endemic problem here?
Yeah, and these folks are mostly. I mean, I'm not. There are people on the FCC that have done good work, and there are people on the FCC that do try to do good work. But generally, yes, I think you wind up with a lot of people that are just biding their time for their next opportunity. It's very rare that I see someone at the FCC who's even willing to publicly state that telecom monopolies are a problem. Like my example in Seattle, like you could dig through the last 20 years of public speeches from FCC officials and not find many of them that's willing to say Comcast monopoly is a problem and we should probably think about doing something about that. We can't even do that, much less develop broad policies to tackle this stuff. So Democrats are generally a little better on this stuff. They at least make passing efforts to think about stuff like diversity and deployment, because there are some discrimination issues that have come up over the years about getting fiber evenly deployed. But still, generally, both parties have not done what I would call a great job at protecting consumers from telecom monopolies. And it's going to get worse.
Yeah. Well, and actually what you just said, I wanted to make sure that I understand because, obviously we're painting with a broad brush and, I think we could highlight kind of individual commissioners and statements and actions that have been positive. But,
yeah.
but if I could summarize what you've said, it would be sort of the baseline of the FCC is not great, even in an administration that would be interested in, sort of pursuing regulatory options and trying to wield the power of the executive to try and expand access to broadband and that sort of thing.
Correct.
That's the baseline going into Donald
right,
Trump.
Right.
And now we're going to talk about Trump's nominee to head the FCC, Brendan Carr. So, it starts off in a spot that would require a lot of hands-on care, and we're going to go from there. Is that fair?
Yeah, it's fair. I would like to say that the FCC has done certain things that are beneficial and good. Like, last year they admitted that racial discrimination in broadband deployment does exist. And minority people in some communities pay more for less service. That they've tried to police certain things like sneaky fees on your bills occasionally. So they do things, but they tend to be a little bit decorative, and they never strike at the root of the problem, which is consolidated monopoly power. So you wind up with a lot of regulatory performance, even in the best of days, I guess is what I'd say.
Okay, so let's now talk about the governing structure of the FCC, because I think that's where that rubber's about to meet the road here with Brendan Carr, right?
Yeah, so there's 5 commissioners. Usually the party that controls the White House appoints 3 of them. So usually the votes come down on a partisan split of 3-2 in favor of whatever party's in control. And when, Brendan Carr was appointed to the FCC by Trump in 2017, most of his tenure has involved voting down pretty much every effort to hold telecom giants accountable. His big focus has been stripping away media consolidation. And while a lot of the press coverage is focusing on his problematic threats to leverage FCC authority to stifle journalism and speech, I think his primary function at the FCC is to ensure that the agency can't engage in meaningful consumer protection and stand up to telecom giants. I think that has been and will be his primary function on that agency.
Counterpoint, I have heard that, quote, Commissioner Carr is a warrior for free speech and has fought against the regulatory lawfare that has stifled Americans' freedoms and held back our economy. He will end the regulatory onslaught that has been crippling America's job creators and innovators and ensure that the FCC delivers for rural America.
Yeah.
That's Trump's announcement of his nomination. Do we think that's how that's going to play out?
No. I'm afraid to say that is incorrect, most likely. I think he's an interesting animal because he spent so much of his time arguing that the FCC has no authority to protect consumers. It has no authority to stand up to AT&T and Comcast on meaningful issues. It doesn't have the authority to enforce net neutrality or privacy rules. But then he'll turn right around and claim that the FCC has this broad authority to regulate TikTok, or social media companies that don't properly bend the knee to authoritarianism. So he's not legally consistent. He'll frame this stuff in a very sensible package that I think less informed journalists can easily parrot unintentionally. But there's no there, with him. His logic on this stuff is all over the map.
Can you give me an example of that kind of packaging that you're thinking about?
Well, just the argument that he's for free speech. A lot of their stuff involves basically they want to leverage FCC authority to threaten tech companies that moderate, race baiting propaganda or racial hatred on the internet. They're inverted. They want to bully broadcasters who speak critically of Trump. He wants to leverage FCC authority to challenge journalists and yell at journalists and scare journalists away from being critical of Trumpism, which is, should probably go without saying, not free speech. So he's not consistent on these issues. He never has been in my entire time reporting and watching him. So, yeah.
And I would layer on top of that Carr was the person who publicly and ridiculously claimed that Saturday Night Live, inviting Kamala Harris on for a guest spot violated the FCC's equal time rule, which, it is wrong at every level of resolution.
Right. I mean, one thing it didn't because they gave Trump, I think, some time and a couple days later on a NASCAR segment on TV, right. So he got equal time. But also Republicans have historically not supported those policies to begin with. They're very convenient right. when they want to come out and say, I support deregulation, but then suddenly I want to regulate things in very strange and inconsistent ways. So again, there's no there. The logic doesn't ever apply. And I see people, trying to analyze his legal thinking in very nuanced ways. And I'm like, there's no, there's no thread to pull on. It's all over the place.
Since we're talking about the First Amendment issues, can we talk about NewsGuard? Can we?
Yeah, I tracked that a little bit. Yeah.
Yeah. So do you want to talk about the issue there, and then I can read this tweet? You know what? I'll read the tweet first. Here's what he said: okay. Facebook, Google, Apple, Microsoft, and others have played central roles in the censorship cartel. The Orwellian named NewsGuard, along with, quote, fact-checking groups and ad agencies, helped enforce one-sided narratives. The censorship cartel must be dismantled. Do you want to explain what the hell that's about?
So NewsGuard basically goes around and ranks websites and journalism outlets based on their bias, or their partisan bias or how reliable they are. And historically, I don't think they've done a particularly good job of that. I've seen them give Ben Shapiro credibility he doesn't deserve. It took them forever to register the fact that Fox News had an ideological bias. I don't think historically they've done a great job. But the very act of anybody suggesting that Republican news isn't actually news or that Republican propaganda exists is a threat to them. So Republican policies, if you sit down, are broadly pretty unpopular. Stripping away consumer protections, getting rid of environmental rights,
abortion,
making life easy. Yeah, right. Women's reproductive rights, billionaire tax rates. So they realized that eventually they have to use propaganda to befuddle the press and the public to get them on board with this stuff. And pretty much this all has to do with them wanting to take aim and target anybody who calls out their bullshit. That's at the base of all of this stuff. So if you're a journalist that criticizes Trumpism, you have liberal bias, you should be kicked offline, you're engaged in dangerous speech.
We're in trouble.
Yeah, a lot of us are. If you're a tech company that decides to moderate race-baiting right-wing propaganda on your platforms, you're at the front, you're censor, you're vile. So this is all bullying. This is all bullying designed to ensure that Republican right-wing race-baiting propaganda cannot be reined in, because that's really mostly what they have at this point, at least this version of Republican policy, Trumpism 2.0.
Do you see this mostly as kind of working the refs? I mean, look, I'm in media, you're in media. You've seen this for a long time, the way that Republicans kind of complain. I mean, let me back up. For a long time, we saw Devin Nunes and the rest of the sort of crew complaining that they were being shadow banned on Twitter. That was like their whole thing for a long time. And I was never clear whether they intended to kind of make real threats or just like work the refs. Even before Elon Musk bought Twitter, it was very clear that they were sort of bending over backwards, as Facebook bent over backwards to not censor or not moderate disinformation, sometimes dangerous misinformation, because they were every time that they fact checked anything, Republicans screamed bloody murder about anti-conservative bias and censorship. So I'm interested in your thoughts whether this is, in some sense, just kind of trying to cow the platforms into never fact checking, or
Yeah,
they really do intend to do something about it.
I think it's both. I think they'll do whatever within the confines of the law available to them. I think they both want to bully journalists and tech companies, and they'll do whatever's necessary to get them to avoid, quote unquote, censoring Republican thought. You've probably seen all the studies that show that Republicans do tend to run more afoul of content moderation on tech platforms, but that's usually because they're more likely to be spreading, racist speech or false news. So their real goal, again, is to ensure that nobody, whether it's a journalist or a content moderation system at Google, can stifle their right wing propaganda. That, to me, is what this really is about. And I think a lot of the debates kind of get murky and lost in legal weeds sometimes about it.
Mm-hmm.
But I think they primarily, because their policies are unpopular, they want to make it impossible for anybody to do anything about right wing propaganda. Since the 70s, they've had this idea that any criticism of Republican policy is liberal bias and should be discarded.
Right.
That's simply evolved now into the modern era with all these debates over content moderation. Anybody who moderates a Republican saying racist, terrible things on the internet is a terrible censor, who should be shamed and harassed and fired from their jobs. And it's authoritarianism. It's effectively, they want to make sure that nobody can stop their efforts to spread right-wing bile and propaganda on the internet. And Carr is very keen on trying to leverage the FCC's authority to do things like use Section 230 to make sure that tech companies can't do content moderation, but he has no such authority.
Okay, hold that thought, because I really do want to ask you about that right after we take one quick ad break. And we're back. Okay, I do want to ask you that question. So tell me whether Carr has the authority, or will have the authority when he is FCC commissioner, to do the things that he's going to do, to enact these censorship policies, to police Section 230. I think he's saying like Section 230, which is as we've talked about a bunch on the show, Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act protects websites from defamation, basically, for user-generated content, and holds them not responsible for it. And what his claim is that basically if websites moderate, or I guess he's saying that NewsGuard is a sort of a censorship regime. And so he's saying if websites kind of kick off offensive content because of NewsGuard, or refuse to advertise on Twitter because other websites say Twitter doesn't protect them, that it is sort of an antitrust violation, or that that websites lose their Section 230 protection. And I'm wondering if you think that that's a power that he has.
No, he has no authority over tech companies at all. Section 230, he has no relevance there. The FCC has no role to play there. He's pretended, when as soon as he realized he had the chance to be FCC boss, he started kissing up to Trump by going on cable news and whining about TikTok constantly and claiming that the FCC had broad authority to regulate TikTok, which it does not.
Right? Is it TikTok? TikTok is an app.
Yeah, it's a tech company. He has no authority there. It's all gibberish. It's nonsense.
It has nothing to do with government allocated spectrum or anything like that.
Right. Now the FCC does have some authority over broadcasters in terms of broadcast licenses, but NBC itself, Saturday Night Live, you can't pull his threat to pull NBC's broadcast license is also kind of gibberish. Mm-hmm. Because NBC has some affiliates that have broadcast licenses in some locations, but that process is very cumbersome. It takes forever. There was an effort by activists to pull the broadcast license of a Fox affiliate in, I think it was Philadelphia, for electoral fraud claims. Mm-hmm. And that got bogged down in legalese forever. So it's a very cumbersome process to do that. Now, that's not to say he can't use his bully pulpit to threaten people in really terrible ways. He's definitely going to pretend, since the public is not particularly informed on these issues, he's going to pretend that the FCC has all this authority. And the very act of going on a cable news channel and singling out a company and directing, hordes of Republican supporters towards that company can have an impact. I mean, that's problematic. So I still think you already see it. You see tech companies, reining in their content moderation. You see news organizations like MSNBC, even, which is as close as U.S. gets to progressive cable news, they're even kind of softening their rhetoric towards Republicans. So it does have that impact. It bullies companies who don't want to be in the limelight to take steps to protect Republican speech, which is all this has ever been about. It's not about free speech. It's about protecting Republican speech and concepts and ideals that Republicans, right-wing Trumpists approve of. That's all it's ever been about. The free speech thing is an entire red herring. And I see people get caught in these deep legal conversations about free speech, and there's no center to their ideology there. Their interests are purely in power and profit and protecting their ideology. Their interests have nothing to do with protecting free speech or consumers or anybody else. And we're about to head into a 4-year period where people are going to learn that quite painfully.
Yeah, I'm so interested to see what happens with the jawboning cases we talked about at the Supreme Court, because that was kind of Republicans freaking out that the White House or the Biden administration had the temerity to note that, noted vaccine deniers and misinformation purveyors were violating social media platforms' terms of service by the platform's own rules and asking for that content to be taken down. And so Republicans sued over that and said, look, this is a gross violation of our First Amendment rights because the platforms essentially become the government when they, accede to government requests. And now you've got the exact opposite, which is Carr making explicit complaints. In fact, Trump's campaign filed an FCC complaint about that Saturday Night Live skit with Kamala Harris. And indeed, the lawyer who filed that, David Warrington, is just been announced is going to be the White House counsel. So that's terrible. Trump
2.0 is going to be a whole new ballgame. I think some people will get a general understanding, but I don't think people appreciate what's coming. Even Ajit Pai, who used to run the FCC in Trump's first term, wouldn't stoop. He wouldn't stoop to a threatening broadcast license. He had some standards there. Carr has no such standards. He'll do whatever's necessary to look good in the eyes of the boss. And so I think between the Supreme Court rulings that set down some dangerous precedents and control of both houses of Congress and no incentive to care about getting reelected for a second term, you've got a completely different ballgame here than we saw in the first Trump term. And I think so many of these debates are going to be overshadowing the fact that the real goal here is to dismantle labor rights, dismantle consumer protections, dismantle environmental standards of any kind. And I'm not sure the press even really has portrayed to the public how ugly that's going to get.
I really appreciate you highlighting that. That's been a theme of ours since, November 5th here. And I think there's just so much that I want to unpack about what you've just said. But I know Liz has a question first.
Yeah, you mentioned the Supreme Court a couple of times. Can you kind of lay out exactly what you mean there?
Well, there's been several rulings. Loper-Bright, of course, which you guys have covered extensively, basically is declaring that regulators can't act unless it's explicitly approved by Congress, right? Mm-hmm. And the pretense there is that U.S. regulators have run amok and we need greater, oversight. And if Congress didn't dictate it, the lawfare of regulation, right? But the problem is that they've ignoring that Congress is completely corrupted to the point where you can't pass any reforms whatsoever. So if Congress can't pass a new reform and regulators lack the independence to do much of anything outside of really strict basic concepts, you're basically talking about dismantling federal governance. I mean, and I don't think that is discussed. I've read in journalism stories I've read, I fall asleep by the fourth paragraph. These are very high stakes issues we're talking about here. These are very profound harms coming to people in terms of stripping away labor rights and consumer protections. People are going to die. And I'll read, I'll go on the newswires and I'll pluck a story off the newswires, and it'll take me to the 18th paragraph for me to realize that this is really going to impact anybody. I fall asleep halfway through the story.
Right.
And as these problems start to emerge, I think there's going to be a real awakening here, probably by next summer or so. I would hope that people start to see the impact of these decisions.
I don't mean to add to your terror, but layered on top of Loper-Bright, which governs the standards of how explicit that grant of authority from Congress must be to an executive agency, are the efforts by the folks who are about to be in the new administration to revive a century-old doctrine called the non-delegation doctrine that says even when Congress is very explicit about the power, that there's some powers that Congress just can't delegate to an executive branch agency for mumble reasons.
Yeah, yeah,
I mean, there's a reason that it has. But so yeah, they're attacking it from every.
yeah,
I mean, I think the idea that you have a political party that is wedded to the ideology of government cannot accomplish things, and then when they get into office, break everything and point to it and say, "See, we told you they couldn't do anything,"
yeah.
is a terrifying structural issue.
Yeah, I'm seeing telecom giants already in 3 different courts argue that the FCC has no authority to do anything. You've got
Yeah.
the FCC tried to enforce some privacy standards for wireless companies that were tracking user location data and then selling it to any nitwit with 2 nickels to rub together. That's on the rocks. I forget what the exact Supreme Court ruling they were citing there. The Universal Service Fund the FCC has that is
Mhm.
designed to ensure we can fund broadband to schools in rural America. I think the Fifth Circuit, am I correct, is about to dismantle that, possibly. Net neutrality is
Yes.
about to be dismantled by the Sixth Circuit Court. So I'm seeing these telecom already. I mean, and Trump isn't even in office yet. And I'm seeing
Right.
these lobbyists and lawyers in all these court venues saying that the government has no authority to protect consumers whatsoever. And again, when I read journalism about this, that point is missing most of the
Yeah.
time. This is
Well,
problematic.
and I'm sorry to be the person every time you say, "and there's no bottom," to come in and go, "and by the way, here's where the bottom falls out from that as well."
Yeah.
But the last Supreme Court decision that we haven't talked about and the way in which this interacts is the corner post decision, right? Which essentially eliminated the statute of limitations, right? It says that the injury begins to run not from the date that the executive branch agency issues its final rule or regulation, which has been understood since time immemorial, right? But from when the affected entity is affected by it, right? Which essentially means you can create a brand new group, have it be subject to 100-year-old regulation and revive the statute of limitations and bring a fresh challenge. And, we've talked about that in a lot of other ways, but certainly, that's going to intersect when you're talking about the efforts of tech giants who do not lack for funds.
Yeah. What could possibly go wrong? Yeah.
Right,
Yeah.
exactly.
Yeah. In telecom, I'm seeing a lot of these battles, of course, shift to the state level. When they killed net neutrality, the first Trump FCC, they tried to declare that not only was enforcing consumer protection on the federal level illegal, they tried to claim that states now had no authority to protect broadband consumers either. Courts shot that down repeatedly.
Because the federal government has occupied the field.
Yeah. But, courts ruled that if the FCC is going to give up consumer protection on the federal level, they can't then go and say that the states can't do their jobs and fill that vacuum. So a lot of these fights are going to head to the states, like net neutrality, privacy, broadband stuff. But these states are going to be so swamped with all these other cases about immigration and everything else. The idea that Washington State, the state I live in, can suddenly do all of that and stand up to all these corporations across 17 different industries that are going to be trying to pull trickery is just it's madness.
Yeah, you've written a lot about broadband to consumer broadband. Do you want to talk about some of the issues that you see upcoming there and what states could do if they had the bandwidth, they weren't fighting all the time about immigration and whatever crazy shit that's coming down the pipeline?
So there's all kinds of stuff, like the FCC's declaration last year that there is racial discrimination in broadband was important because it at least acknowledged that these companies are discriminating when they deploy fiber into certain neighborhoods, and the FCC order didn't do a ton, but at least acknowledged that it was a problem. That's going to be gone.
I just want to cut in. When you say discriminating, is that analogous to redlining? I mean, talk a little bit about the mechanics.
Yeah, it's very similar to the stuff we saw, with the highway deployments and with early power line deployments. There's obvious discrimination intent in a lot of these things. And the FCC basically, they didn't even call out companies by name. They didn't even decide to go back and do anything about it. They simply acknowledged that this racism exists, which is important if you're trying to build policy around broadband deployment.
And by that, you mean decisions by the telecom companies to lay the infrastructure and deliver broadband in areas that manifest in obviously racially discriminatory ways, right? Grossly overserved white areas, grossly underserved minority areas.
Right. And not only that, but charging minority areas more money for slower service. That's been documented as well. So the FCC was finally taking a look at that. That's going to be all but dead. The FCC was also looking at broadband usage caps, which are these technically unnecessary limits on your broadband line that make you pay extra if you go over a set threshold. The FCC was just starting to take action. They were thinking about doing something about that. That's dead. the Universal Service Fund, which is helping deploy broadband to schools. That's an FCC program that basically you pay into via your, traditionally it was mostly paid into via your phone bill.
So it's like a little surcharge. It's one of these tiny surcharges.
And that money just went to help, libraries in rural towns get connected, and schools, and, some of these rural areas, because these companies obviously don't think it's worth their time financially to service some of these areas. So taxpayers lended a hand. It was traditionally a bipartisan program with bipartisan support. But as phone lines have died, the contribution base has sagged quite a lot. So now there's a big debate coming up as to how we fund those programs. And Brendan Carr's big solution for this, which is why I tend to think the Supreme Court won't destroy the USF, because I think this is the ultimate plan. Brendan Carr's solution is to tax tech companies billions of new dollars, like on your Netflix bill or your Google service bill, and then give that to their friends in telecom, who historically have had a pretty shaky history in terms of taking taxpayer subsidies and spending them responsibly. So I think that's going to be a big Carr initiative that'll probably be overlooked in the new year.
Can I ask you what you mean by tax the tech companies? Are you saying that will be like Netflix will add an extra $1 or an extra 27 cents or whatever to your
$2
bill?
$2 on your bill, yeah.
Right. It'll be theoretically allocated to expanding rural broadband, but actually it will go to
Some of it might wind its way to actual rural broadband, but most of it will wind its way to Comcast and AT&T, who already have historically taken billions upon billions of dollars and then turned around and half deployed fiber networks all over the country. So
interesting.
I think there's going to be a big debate in the new year about how to fund this program. I think a lot of it's going to be misleading. And I think Brendan Carr, who has, advocated for this particular approach, is going to be spearheading most of that.
Can I ask you why the cable companies would go along with that? I mean, obviously, if they could pass it on to consumers, that's good for them. But why would they want something which will kind of make everybody's bill higher? I'm just a little confused as to why this wouldn't be challenged in the Fifth Circuit, why Ken Paxton wouldn't automatically challenge it.
For somebody like Comcast, if we apply a tax to Netflix bills and consumers pay slightly more and it gets passed on to Comcast is certainly happy to be additionally subsidized by the government. They're going to argue it's for the greater good. And then they're going to take, 70% of that and pocket it. Mm-hmm. They're going to take 30% of it to actually deploy real rural. And Trump's FCC, when Brendan Carr was there previously as a commissioner, did not do a very good job in terms of tracking how broadband subsidies were spent. There was a program called the Rural Digital Opportunity Fund that Trump's first commission oversaw, in which a lot of companies applied for subsidies and took billions of dollars for networks they really couldn't deploy. The Trump's FCC did not do a good job ensuring that these companies could actually deploy that, or that it would be affordable, or that it would be evenly deployed. So the idea that we're going to implement big reforms and start taxing people a lot more money to fund rural broadband sounds nice on its surface, but it's going to be quite a convoluted mess in practice.
Right, if it winds up being basically a boondoggle. But you think that the Supreme Court is going to kind of let that one be?
I suspect. I've seen smarter people and better informed legal experts than me explain why. And there are articles out there talking about the Universal Service Fund that we can maybe link to.
Interesting. We'll definitely put that in the show notes.
I don't want to build like a tri-corner tinfoil hat here, but I will point out that the alternative to delivering broadband to rural areas is internet via satellite, and that Elon Musk is the 100% owner of Starlink, which is the largest provider of the services. And there have been tremendous, I mean, we don't have the time to dig into the specifics. I know you're aware of it, of just what a boondoggle that has been even pre-Trump, even during the Biden administration with Starlink, taking grants that were designed to spread satellite internet to rural areas and instead, tripling service at airports and, otherwise not at all comporting with the mission. But looks like you've got a story in mind there. So.
Yeah, that program I just mentioned, that Rural Digital Opportunity Fund, under Trump tried to give Elon Musk Starlink $1 billion to deliver satellite broadband to ultimately what wound up being some traffic medians and some airport parking lots. Mm-hmm. The Biden FCC came in and said, all right, this is taxpayer money. We don't, satellite broadband is good if you're in the middle of nowhere, but it's expensive. Starlink is expensive. It has limited capacity. There's environmental concerns related to ozone layer damage, astronomical research harms. So the Biden FCC came in and said, well, if we're going to spend taxpayer money, it might be best to spend it on future-proof fiber networks or 5G wireless networks. they're proven. We can get them out into these areas. Starlink doesn't really scale to handle the full scope of
Right.
the rural broadband problem. It has limited capacity, even with the full array of satellites, which aren't even in space yet. That gets overlooked. So I think, yes, I think in the new year, you've got $42.5 billion coming to the broadband industry via the infrastructure bill. And I think the Republicans, including Carr, I mean, the program's under the NTIA, not the FCC, but I think Republican big initiative in the new year will be to redirect as much of that money as they can to Elon Musk's Starlink. You got your satellite broadband, good enough, let's not worry about it. When I think ideally you want fiber in a lot of these areas, like open access fiber networks for affordable access.
Well, that leads to like the kind of inescapable tech journalist question, right? Like, what does Elon Musk want from Trump? What is Elon Musk doing here? I mean, aside from making himself the main character in every story, which I think is certainly can't be discounted as a prime motivator of a person who's pretty clearly unstable. But from your perspective, since Elon Musk has made himself the center of every story, what do you think that Elon Musk's goal here is?
He wants as much taxpayer subsidy money as he could possibly hoard. He
Mm-hmm.
wants to get rid of environmental standards for space launches. He wants to get rid of any kind of consumer protection oversight for all of his companies. He wants to end the numerous inquiries into multiple fraud accusations and problems with misrepresented self-driving car technology.
Right.
So basically, he wants to eliminate oversight and get as much money as possible. I mean, it's an age-old tale. What he's after isn't unique to billionaire industrialists. It's the ultimate goal, to be able to accumulate as much money as possible, free of any kind of oversight or restrictions, regardless of the impact the greed has on the public or markets or consumers or the environment. So.
Okay. And speaking of media, since that's the kind of dying industry that you and I hail from, or certainly...
Thanks, Liz.
I mean, tell me how you think that Carr is going to kind of impact media generally.
Under the first FCC, there was a push to eliminate what was left of media consolidation limits for the benefit mostly of broadcasters like Sinclair Broadcasting, which were trying to acquire, I think, Tribune for several $1 billion at the time.
Well, can I just interrupt you before you get to that? Can you explain to people who kind of haven't thought through it all the way why media consolidation is bad?
So ultimately and ideally, the FCC is supposed to enforce media consolidation limits because you want a diverse array of journalistic opinion and ownership. You don't want you don't want a handful of billionaires controlling the entirety of media, because as we're seeing now, I think especially during the last election, that filters down into the coverage. As I think, newsrooms deny that they insist there's an editorial firewall between ownership and coverage, but it's pretty clear, looking at our consolidated media, how coverage is really quite tailored towards making money and corporate interests. I mean, it's hard to deny.
Right. This morning, I think Fox named Donald Trump like Patriot of the Year, which, look, Fox is ridiculous, okay, but we all saw, Jeff Bezos kill the Washington Post endorsement. Patrick Soon-Shiong, who's the owner of the LA Times, is now like requiring any headline that has political implications to run by him, and he also killed the presidential endorsement of Kamala Harris. So, yes, I think we can see the problem.
Yeah, you also see it at CNN under David Zaslav. You see how that network is kind of shifting right, hiring more Republican commentators, being softer on their criticism of Republican policy. And I think under Trump 2.0, you're going to see just a huge new wave of consolidation, not just in traditional broadcasters, the major 4 or 5. They're going to want to merge, but you're also going to see it in streaming. The streaming TV market is pretty saturated at this point, and they've run out of growth options to please Wall Street. So usually what happens then is consolidation kicks in, and you propose these giant pointless mergers that, get them some tax breaks and boost the stock a little bit, but ultimately wind up resulting in thousands of layoffs, a worse quality product overall. And I think you're seeing that in media, and you've been seeing that for the past 25 years. And I think you're going to start seeing that in streaming as well.
Okay, so one more question, kind of not related to what we've talked about. What do you think is going to happen with TikTok?
I'm not sure. Originally Trump wanted to ban it because he was hoping to offload it to his friends at Walmart and Oracle.
Yeah.
And then now that one of his major contributors, I forget the guys, there's another billionaire ally of his who owns a big stake in TikTok, has been trying to get him to reverse the ban. So I wouldn't be surprised if they reverse that ban, although from my understanding, that's going to be difficult.
Right.
I personally think the ban was kind of silly to begin with.
Of course it is.
If we're really concerned about consumer privacy and propaganda, there's things we could do, like pass a real privacy law,
Right.
or
Right,
crack down on data brokers.
Right. It's Mark Zuckerberg owns every piece of your data, right? Like, come on, we're worried about that Chinese
one
government.
single app. We conquered one single app in an ocean of data surveillance.
Yeah.
But I suspect they'll find a way to reverse that ban, although I can't say that for sure.
Why would they piss off every kid in America?
Yeah,
like,
it was always.
What are you doing? You're not going to take that away from the children.
I don't know why Democrats decided to run down that rabbit hole in an election season to begin with. That of all the things you can spend your time focusing on, they want to ban one of the most popular apps amongst teenagers. Because they purportedly care about privacy suddenly when we haven't passed a privacy law in the last 15 years. So I don't.
Right.
That whole
I could join you in that rabbit hole of introspection, but let me try and hit. Look. We've had a lot of doom and gloom in this interview. Yeah. And I think
that's because it's gloomy.
Right, exactly. And we don't shy away from that because, that's what it's going to be like. We're not going to be able to muster opposition to prevent Donald Trump from installing Brendan Carr to head the FCC. What can we do in the age of Trump? Like how do we, push back, help people stay informed? Like, what are your thoughts on what we can do?
You have to think smaller. You have to fight locally. Mm-hmm. If there's a journalist you like, throw him some money. Go find their newsletter, give them money. If you find an independent journalism organization, give them some money. Stop paying big conglomerates. If you're spending money on journalism, stop giving it to big conglomerates and start finding the individual journalists themselves and try to fund them. Also, the fight are local. In broadband policy, a lot of these fights are now shifting to the state and local level, where there is hope. Still, a lot of these states are going to be fighting for consumer rights. So I still find hope in the local activism. I spend time writing and doing research for an organization called the Institute for Local Self-Reliance, which helps local communities build alternatives to consolidated monopoly power. Our focus there is on broadband policy and helping smaller towns build their own fiber networks. And I think there's a lot of hope there in bonding together on a smaller scale, local level, rebuilding community there, and then pushing outward again. It's clear to me that federal governance is in some very deep trouble. And our only alternative there is to fight locally, block by block, to reclaim some kind of rights.
Okay, well, that's going to do it for us. I guess that's like the happiest note we could have ended this interview on. But yesterday we listened to the Supreme Court's Skrmetti decision and wrote 2,000 words on it. So we're having a doom and gloom moment here on the show. Thank you so very much, Karl, for joining us.
Thank you. I really appreciate it. It was great talking to you.
I am so glad we got to talk to Karl. I mean, not only is he an expert, but I think, look, you and I have talked a bunch about how we need to kind of have a seriousness of purpose going into the Trump administration and not get bogged down. Like, we're going to have a really good time in the Patreon bonus talking about Rudy Giuliani, who is truly a gift to you and me both. But there are serious things going on, and this is a serious moment, and we're all going to kind of have to pay attention to policy in addition to litigation, because, I mean, that's where the rubber's going to meet the road.
Yeah. Part of their strategy is to distract us and journalists by trolling the libs, right? By getting us to talk about the truly atrocious and stupid things that they're saying. And we're not going to not talk about that, right? Like we do, but getting into the weeds of what this means, right? When you replace competent civil servants with sycophants, this is part of what happens. So I agree with you 100%.
Okay, that's going to do it for us today, unless you're Patreon. See you guys. Have a good weekend.
Law and Chaos Podcast is a production of Raise Ipsa Media, LLC, is intended solely as entertainment, does not constitute legal advice, and does not form an attorney-client relationship. This show is researched and written by Liz Dye and produced by Bryce Blankenagel. Law and Chaos Pod, copyright 2024, Raise Ipsa Media, LLC, all rights reserved.